On the coastline of Turkey, at a place known as Hisarlik Hill, lie the ruins of the legendary city of Troy. But did the Trojan War actually take place here? The story was made famous by the Greek poet Homer in his book The Iliad. He describes a 10-year siege of Troy by the Greeks, followed by a violent battle and brutal destruction of the city. Trojan survivors were taken prisoner by the Greeks. Investigators have hunted for proof of war for decades and realized that the ruins represent at least 9 distinct layers of occupation.
We have evidence for human occupation at this site, which lasts over 3,500 years.
2 different archaeologists can look at the same section that's been excavated and look at the different layers and interpret them, in some cases, completely differently.
Early explorer Heinrich Schliemann struggled to identify the layer that coincided with the war, the end of the Bronze Age around 1200 BC. But in the 1930s, archaeologist Carl Blegen starts a more thorough search of the site and finds evidence of fire and bodies in a layer matching the war's supposed date. Was this proof that the war really happened? In the Netherlands, at the University of Amsterdam, Gert-Jan van Wijngaarden and his team investigate the work of early archaeologists at Troy.
The relation between the archaeological site and the Homeric Troy is so fascinating that people become more or less addicted by it. Blegen, for example, begin with pure archaeology, a purely archaeological approach. But as time progresses, they do become interested in these mythical connections to the site.
The problem for archaeologists is that evidence of fire isn't proof enough on its own that a war or battle took place. So what other clues can investigators find in layers Troy 6 or Troy 7 to prove that the Trojan War was real? Treasures at the Museum of Troy could hold clues. 1200 BC in the Eastern Mediterranean corresponds with the end of the Bronze Age. It's a period characterized by the development of the metalworking industry, when ancient craftspeople mastered the casting of soft metals and created the first alloys, like bronze, formed from copper and tin. Today, scientists are looking for evidence of war amongst the bronze artifacts discovered in the ruins of Troy.
Oksidasyona uğramış olan eserlerden 4 tanesini alalım şimdilik. Evet.
Şu eseri alalım. Bunda yoğun aktif var. Şunu da alalım.
Nuver Ferendeci and Betel Oatsman use a digital microscope to examine the artifacts for signs of decay.
Bir sabit tutar mısın? Sabit tut, fotoğraf alayım. Şu an evet eser yüzeyinde ve derinlemesinde çatlak da var galiba. Çok ince. Alayım mı fotoğraf?
Archaeologist Hadzal Firat is responsible for separating the tools of war from tools of everyday life.
Betül'deki Betül sendeki zaten direkt bir keski. Keski formunda olduğu için direkt bunun için keski diyebiliriz. Şu kısımdan takılıyor, ahşap bir sapı oluyor genellikle. Parça koparmak için, oymak için kullanılan aletlerimizden bir tanesi.
Most of the bronze objects that archaeologists have unearthed here are evidence of routine life in the lost city. Excavators have found very few weapons. But why, if a destructive war took place here?
Bunlar kazısı yapılıyor yani 3 tane 5 tane bulundu. Çünkü silah ve metal değerli tekrar kullanılıyor. Mızraklar, okuşları gene şu mesela eğik olan duvara herhalde. Yani bunlardan yüzlerce olabilirdi. Fakat metalin değerli metal yani bir malzeme olduğunu biliyoruz, tekrar kullanıldığını biliyoruz.
With bronze weapons too valuable to leave on the battlefield, investigators will need to look elsewhere for evidence that the Trojan War really happened. And they find clues in Homer's story of the Iliad. According to Homer, the Greeks surrounded the city of Troy for 10 years, but couldn't breach its defenses. The Trojans built colossal walls flanked by enormous towers that kept the assailants at bay. The many battles that Homer describes all take place beneath these walls, on the plains between the sea and the city of Troy.
We don't hear a lot in Homer about the internal layout of the city of Troy. What we get is a lot of detail about its fortifications, and especially the walls and the grand towers that defended the city.
Could investigating the ruins of defenses prove that the Trojan War happened here? Clues lie at a wall known as the Northeast Bastion.
İlyon ve Troya'yı tanımlarken, anlatırken pek çok farklı özelliklerden bahsediyor. Bunlardan bir tanesi işte güzel kuleleri olan, büyük surları olan İlyon ve Troya'dan bahsediyor. Burada bunu anlayabiliyoruz.
Ancient builders formed this wall from immense blocks of cut stones. It's a style known as Cyclopean architecture.
Bütün şeyler, taşlar ve duvarlar, son Tunç çağı taşları kireç taşından kesilerek yapılmış. Aslında bu bir tipik bir Anadolu mimarisi ve demirin olmadığı bir dönemde tunç aletlerle kesildiğini biliyoruz.
The walls appear to match those described by Homer in his story, but Cyclopean architecture was common from the end of prehistory until the end of the Bronze Age, a period of nearly 2 millennia. And there's another problem facing archaeologists trying to find a direct link to the Trojan War. The citadel at Hisarlik is far too small to match the descriptions of Homer. He described a city with thousands of inhabitants, but the citadel here could only hold a few hundred people.
Troy, archaeologically speaking, was very small, and there was always suggestion that there was a lower city, even by Schliemann. But Schliemann did not find any evidence for a lower city.
Could there be a much larger lost city, hidden in the plains around Hisarlik Hill? In Greece, Elena Korka and her team are hunting for evidence to prove the existence of another lost city, the city of Tenea, said to have been started by survivors of the Trojan War. Today, the team are photographing and cataloging their finds. Amongst the vases and pottery is a discovery that links directly to the mythical war. Archaeologist Vivi Evagaloglu is examining an artifact with a very special motif.
Πρόκειται για ένα ρωμαϊκό λιχνάρι, το οποίο χρονολογείται από τα μέσα, είναι τοπική παραγωγή, και το σημαντικό σε αυτό το λιχνάρι είναι η αναπαράσταση που έχει στο δίσκο του. Βλέπουμε λοιπόν τον Tenea, ο οποίος εγκαταλείπει.
The discovery exposes the strong connection between the Trojans and the people who lived here during Roman times.
Αλλά όπως και να έχει, είναι ιδιαίτερα συμβολικό και σημαντικό να έχει βρεθεί μια τέτοια αναπαράσταση στην Tenea, γιατί ουσιαστικά κατά κάποιο τρόπο, έστω και έμεσο, συμβολίζει τη σύνδεση με την Τρία. Αυτό δείχνει ουσιαστικά ότι οι Τενεάτες δεν είχαν...
But if the team wants to prove that this city was really founded by survivors of the Trojan War, they need to find evidence that dates back to around 1200 BC. Clues could lie in coins discovered at the site.
Okay, so let's have a look at the data of Corinth.
Konstantinos Lagos is an expert in numismatics, the study of coins.
Actually, can you see the Pegasus?
Yes,
That's-
on the verse.
Yeah, it's incredible. You've got the Pegasus flying on the right. Underneath, there's the Q. At that time, the Q was also in the Greek alphabet. It's Koppa. So that stands for Corinth. So we're talking about, what, the early 5th century BC.
The find pushes the age of this city back some 600 years before the Romans arrived. But the Trojans were said to have founded Tenea another 600 or so years earlier. The team will need to keep digging to look for new clues. In Turkey, archaeologists have discovered the ancient city of Troy. But the citadel ruins don't match the scale of the city described in myth. A breakthrough would only be possible using cutting-edge technology. In 1988, a German archaeologist called Manfred Korfmann takes charge of excavations at Hisarlik. He believes that the ruins unearthed at the citadel are just part of a much larger lost city. He launches an immense campaign of excavations lasting 15 years with 370 archaeologists. Alongside him were Rustin Aslan, Rayan Korpe, Ernst Pernica, and Brian Rose.
We were the first to be able to present a plan of that area due to the magnetic prospection, the remote sensing that we did throughout that area. That was the first time anyone was able to come to a clear understanding of what the lower city was like.
The team made use of new technology that measures the strength of the local magnetic field to scan the ground and look for buried structures. They discovered something astonishing: a lost lower city at the foot of the hill on which Troy stood. The city covers an area some 10 times larger than the citadel, just like Homer portrayed. In the middle of the 2000s, the team excavated nearly 150,000 square feet of the lost ruins. But even that only represented some 2% of the lower city of Troy. In Amsterdam, Gert-Jan and his team are re-examining the discoveries that Manfred Korfmann made.
This is the map of 1994 made by our German colleagues from Korfmann excavations. And you can see that specific sections in the 19th century were not excavated, because this part is not excavated. This took several years to measure in exactly.
The team's investigations of the history of archaeology at Troy exposed the extraordinary effort that went into mapping the site. Now the team are looking for modern ways to chart the excavations and think that new technology holds the answer. In 2019, the team from Amsterdam takes the latest drone technology to the ancient site. They are able to accurately map the area in a single day. Jita Wagen specializes in digital archaeology.
And this is the drone that we used at Troy. So this one actually has a dual gimbal, which means you can take 2 cameras up into the air if you want.
To map the ruins of Troy, Jita chose to use a technique called photogrammetry.
What you do is you fly over the area you want to capture, and then on regular intervals you make a photograph.
The result is a 3D representation that archaeologists can use to examine the site from every angle.
This is the citadel. Yeah. So the lower city is at that end. You have here the Schliemann trenches over here. If you imagine that Troy has been measured using various techniques from very old-fashioned to recent, for almost 150 years. And now you fly 2 hours over the site with the drone and you have everything in 3D.
The densely packed city and heavy stone walls match the descriptions of Troy by Homer. But now there's a new mystery to solve. How could the Trojans have survived 10 years of siege, trapped behind their towering fortifications? To survive, the Trojans would need two key resources: food and water. Archaeological excavations at Troy might have found the solution to one of these problems. Engin Kumali worked at Troy in the early 2000s and helped explore an astonishing discovery: a series of hidden underground tunnels.
2000'de ben işe girdim. 2001'de 3 nolu tüneli temizledik. 6 arkadaş 2 hafta boyunca 12 günde.
Over the centuries, the tunnels had partially collapsed and become filled with earth. When Engin and his colleagues began to explore them, they had no idea what they would find.
Zordu. Şimdi ilk bir yerden girdik biz o iç tarafta. Girdik. Gidiyorsun ama nereye gidiyorsun? Yeniköy'de eski imam vardı bizim çalışan. İkimiz birbirimize ip bağladık belimize. Çünkü nereye gittiğini de bilmem. Önünü şişleyerek. Acaba derin bir yer var mı?
Archaeologists discovered that these tunnels were not natural. They were purpose-built long ago. But when?
Bir insan boyu hemen hemen yükseklik. Kimi yerde yanlamasına geçiyor, kimi yerde böyle enlemesine, kimi yerde yanlamasına geçiliyor.
Investigators found clues on the walls that allowed them to date the tunnels. Marks left by stone tools. They suggest that the tunnels date back to the very beginning of the Bronze Age, so they existed at the time of the legendary Trojan War. But what did the ancient inhabitants of Troy use these tunnels for? Archaeologists found several hundred feet of subterranean passages traversing the city. And at their base, hidden under flat stones, water. Builders dug these tunnels to tap into underground springs, channeling water towards wells.
Şimdi burada 4 nolu kuyudan gelen suyu taşıyan bir su kanalı. Mağaranın bir su yolu yani burası. Buradan gelen su ön tarafta çamaşırhane ve balık havuzlarına gidiyor.
Over the centuries, the inhabitants of Troy extended this tunnel ever deeper, tapping into an increasingly large flow of water. By the end of the Bronze Age, the supposed time of the Trojan War, it must have been enough to ensure a steady supply of water to the city. And the water even allowed them to farm fish within the city's walls. But how could the Trojans store food to resist years of siege? Clues to solve this mystery are in the west of the citadel, in the lower city that Manfred Korfmann excavated. Rustam Aslan was part of the team that uncovered the foundations of a large building. It was built not long before the supposed time of the mythical Trojan War. Ancient engineers built the structure from brick. Archaeologists have been able to figure out what it once looked like, and that the building was covered with a large terrace. Its oversized dimensions are a sign that this was a functional building rather than a home. But what was it used for? Clues unearthed at the site offer an answer. Huge terracotta amphora called pithoi.
Rastlı evin büyük duvarları, gene büyük bir ihtimalle 2 ya da çok katlı bir evin olduğunu tahmin ediyoruz. Ve yan tarafındaki bölmelerde Üzerleri taşla kapalı pitosların olduğu yerleri görüyoruz. Pek çok farklı pitosun olduğunu biliyoruz. Ve özellikle burada enstitü bir şekilde pitoslar hala burada durabiliyor.
The pithoi jars can measure more than 5 feet in height. They were buried up to their neck and sealed with stone covers. The ancient Trojan inhabitants of Troy used the pithoi jars as Bronze Age refrigerators.
Nothing. Büyük bir ihtimalle bu tür küplere su ya da diğer besinlerini koyuyorlardı. Yani pitoslar özellikle yiyeceklerin uzun süre saklanmasında önemli bir depolama kapıydı.
The discovery shows that the building unearthed here was probably a warehouse used to store food for the city.
Yani Troyalılar aslında Troya Savaşı'nın, Troya'ya yapılacak bir saldırının geleceğini görüyorlar, tahmin ediyorlar ve bu nedenle kentlerini, kalelerini kuşatmaya hazırlıyorlar.
The inhabitants of Troy were clearly prepared to withstand a long siege. But to survive the Trojan War, they would need to protect the walls around all of Troy to prevent the Greeks from storming the city. That would be their hardest task yet. Rustem Aslan is looking for evidence of the Trojan defenses. He's come to an area of Troy's citadel known as the West Gate.
Pek çok kez dillendiriliyor, anlatılıyor Homeros tarafından. Akileus'un 3 kere kente girmek için Batı kapısının önünden saldırdığını, Troyalı askerlere saldırdığını İlyada destanında okuyabiliyoruz.
This west gate of the citadel is now walled up. Archaeologists think that the modification dates back to the probable time of the Trojan War, around 1200 BC.
Kenti korumak için bazı mimari önlemlerin alındığını biliyoruz ve güney kapısındaki alınan önlemlere benzer önlemlerden bir tanesi de özellikle belki koruması çok zor olan batı girişinin tümüyle kapatıldığını biliyoruz.
The Trojans in the citadel seem to have expected an attack to come from the west, through the lower city, so reinforcing the defenses around this lower city, where their food and water supplies were, must have been key. Today, almost nothing remains of this lost city above ground. But in the 1990s, archaeologists led by Manfred Korfmann set out to find traces of the defenses using magnetic scanning.
Korfmann initiated a thorough geophysical survey of the hill that was always supposed to contain the lower city. And indeed, a structure was found by geophysical methods. And the New York Times reported that the walls of the lower city were found.
It turned out not to be a wall, but the reality proved even more intriguing.
Now, with the geophysical methods, you can only see structures in the soil, yes? But on excavation, it turned out that it's not a wall, but it's a ditch, so a negative wall.
The team excavated a few feet of the lost ancient trenches. Engin Kumali worked on the excavations.
İşte şehrin etrafında savunma endadı geçiyor. Aşağı şehir, savunma enda. Şimdi şuradan böyle bu şekil gidiyor. Bir bölümü dediler, bir bölümü de bu tarafa. Çünkü aşağısı deniz.
This trench was the first line of defense for the Trojans. But why did they build it? Clues lie in Homer's story of the war. the Greek warriors described by Homer are typical of the late Bronze Age. They are equipped with bronze swords and javelins, bows and arrows, and leather shields. But they have a secret weapon, the war chariot, drawn by horses. It's used by many of the heroes that Homer describes in his epic poem. In Book 5 of the Iliad, he writes of clashes between Greek and Trojan warriors who race towards each other on chariots. And he describes how the Greek hero Achilles kills the Trojan Hector and drags his body around the walls of Troy. Could the trench in the lower city have been designed to stop these terrifying war machines?
The ditch is about 2 meters deep in the basement rock, and you have to assume that there is at least half a meter, maybe a meter of soil cover. So you have a 3 meter and 4 meter wide a ditch, and behind that a moat. And the moat may have been overgrown with thorny bushes and so on. So that's a very effective defensive system. Yeah.
The discovery allows archaeologists to reconstruct what the city of Troy might have looked like. First, a deep trench to trap chariots and slow down soldiers. Behind it, an embankment covered with thorny bushes, perhaps topped with a wooden rampart covered with stakes. The defenses surrounded the lower city with its tightly packed houses, warehouses, and wells. Finally, overlooking everything, the citadel, surrounded by towers and cyclopean ramparts. The last line of defense. A seemingly impregnable city. But now archaeologists are uncovering evidence of Troy's fall. At the foot of the citadel, in the lower city, archaeologist Rayan Korpe is investigating the mystery. In 1995, he made an intriguing discovery.
Yes, muhtemelen buralarda bir yerde olsa gerek bu taşlar. Yani bunlar şu büyüklükte taşlardı. Yani fakat farklı cinste ve daha sert taşlar.
The stones that Rayan unearthed were slingshot ammunition, projectiles used during the Bronze Age and beyond.
Buradaki işçiler aslında bu taş öbeğinin ne olduğunu anlamış değillerdi.
The workers hadn't noticed that the stones were carefully arranged in small piles at the corner of the wall, as if a warrior with a slingshot had been stationed here to defend the walls from enemies.
Ve burada artık kenti savunan belki bir sapancı aşağıdan gelen akalara karşı sapanıyla yani kentini korumaya çalışmış. Çok başarılı olduğunu zannetmiyoruz çünkü sapanları taşlarını bırakmış, muhtemelen öldü ya da öldürüldü ya da belki kaçtı.
Rayan thinks these stones could be evidence that the Trojans were quickly overwhelmed by their assailants. Proof that the city's defenders abandoned their positions with no time to collect their weapons and retreat. Could the stones have been left by a survivor of the Trojan War? In Greece, the archaeological team are trying to find proof that this is where the survivors of the Trojan War ended up, the legendary city of Tenea, home of the last Trojans. They're hunting for clues that the city dates back some 3,200 years to just after the end of the mythical war. Now they've uncovered a large block of stone within a section of Roman walls.
Very big stone, you see.
Yeah. But Elena thinks the stone could be much older.
It's at the very moment of revelation. So, as you see, it comes from a monumental structure because it's a big block.
The stone appears to come from a much older building that stood here before the Romans arrived.
Yes, it is amazing. That's excavation.
A mysterious inscription is engraved onto one of the stone's faces.
Μέχρι στιγμής που έχουμε βγάλει, βέβαια εδώ είναι αυτό εδώ πάλι. Ξάτο έχει ένα κενό που λέει ότι μπορεί να είναι νερό, αλλά δεν βγάζει νόημα.
Γιατί βέβαια το ταν, εάν είναι δωρική διάλεκτος, είναι την.
This Doric dialect is an ancient language that was used in this region between 900 and 600 BC. The team will need to examine the block further to find clues that more accurately date it. At the ruins of Troy in Turkey, archaeologists have found evidence of the city falling to attackers. Homer refers to the story of Troy's fall in his second book, the Odyssey. According to the myth, the Greeks spent 10 years surrounding Troy, unable to breach its walls, until a Greek king called Odysseus comes up with a cunning plan to conceal special forces inside a huge wooden horse. The attackers plan to trick the Trojans into opening their gates. The Greeks drag it to the entrance of Troy, while their army pretends to leave the battlefield and sail home. The Trojans fall for the ruse, believing the giant horse to be a gift dedicated to the goddess Athena. The mystery for the archaeologists today is whether the story is based on a real event. The riddle of the Trojan horse has divided investigators for centuries, with many believing it to be pure poetic invention. But is there another possibility? Could a giant wooden structure of a different kind have allowed the Greeks to breach the Trojan defenses? Archaeologists have found ancient carvings in modern Iraq that show a battering ram called a siege engine. Is this where the myth of a giant wooden horse came from? Ancient engineers built a fortified structure on wheels that they could push towards the enemy walls. A turret allowed warriors to fire arrows at the enemy, or even clamber onto the ramparts. And at the front, they fitted a long battering ram to strike the defensive walls and knock them down. Rayan Korpe thinks there's another explanation to the Trojan horse myth.
Bazı tarihçiler, arkeologlar aslında kentin silah zoruyla Akalar tarafından değil ama kuşatma sırasında olan bir depremin surları yıktığını ve kentin bu şekilde ele geçirildiğini iddia ediyor. Antik çağda insanlar depremleri yapan tanrının deniz tanrısı Poseidon olduğuna inanıyorlar ve at da bu tanrının simgesi. Şimdi at ise tanrı Poseidon'un simgesi. Ele geçirdi ve Poseidon'a şükranlarını sunmak için bir at yaptılar.
The truth about the Trojan horse may never be known. But can investigators prove whether the Trojan War itself is based on a real clash between Greeks and Trojans? The challenge for archaeologists is identifying evidence of one single conflict that could be linked to the ancient myth.
This was a period of frequent conflict. We know that there were burnt destruction horizons in most of the archaeological sites within this wider region. There are sieges, there are military campaigns, there are battles raging all the time.
Now, a surprising clue offers a new avenue of investigation that could transform long-held ideas about the Trojan War. A unique artifact unearthed in the ruins of Troy suggests a link to a mighty civilization that isn't mentioned in the famous story. Manfred Korfmann discovered the only written evidence that dates back to the time period of the war. It's a bronze seal with a name engraved that is linked to a people called the Hittites.
The period in which the Trojan War was alleged to have taken place, which is the Late Bronze Age. It's a time when there were a series of wars between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites.
During the Bronze Age, Troy stood on the edge of a vast Hittite empire. They dominated city kingdoms as far as the Aegean Sea in the west. Could Troy itself have been under their control? Now an ancient tablet adds to the mystery.
Buradaki şey yazılı metin, yani uzun süre işte Troya olamaz Milusa, İlyon, Hisarlık çünkü yazılı metin yok, yazılı metin yok. Al sana yazılı metin.
The tablet was discovered in central Turkey and dates back to 1280 BC. And it would rewrite the history of Troy. It's a treaty of alliance between a Hittite ruler and a king called Alexandru from a city known as Wailusha. Alexandru's name is a surprising link to the Trojan War because Homer says that the Trojan prince Paris is also called Alexandros, and the name of the city of Wailusha is probably derived from the Greek Wilios, an archaic version of Ilios, which became Ilium, the former name of Troy. And there's other evidence to suggest that Wailusha was in fact Troy. The treaty mentions tunnels dug under the city where water flowed, a feature matching the subterranean network discovered at Troy, the only tunnels of this type found anywhere in the area. The Hittite records could be the key to finding the truth about the Trojan War.
The most useful thing for us is that the Hittites kept great records. We hear of the city being attacked by unnamed hostile invaders. We hear of the city falling.
To my mind, the question is not, was there a Trojan War? The question is actually, which of the many that the Hittites talk about is the same Trojan War that Homer is talking about? I think it happened.
Probably there were a lot of these battles that over the course of several hundred years were crystallized into a single battle involving only two opponents and taking place at Troy.
But archaeologists have uncovered clues at the lost city of Troy, which show that the citadel fell at some point after the 12th century BC.
We have evidence in Troy itself that after the 12th century there was an aftermath, but then we have a period of maybe 150, maybe 200 years where we do not find structures in Troy.
The clues unearthed by archaeologists at Hisarlik over the past 150 years show that this is indeed the site of the lost city of Troy. And while there's no conclusive evidence of a single Trojan War, this was the site of epic battles before the city was abandoned.
There are a number of people like myself that do think that it took place, or at the very least that there is a kernel of truth at the basis of the story. But when it comes down to it, whether the actual Trojan War took place is, I wouldn't say it's a moot point, but there are other things that happened at about the same time that we might as well call the Trojan War.
So Homer's description of the fall of Troy may be accurate. Writers give a detailed account of the sack of Troy after the Greeks had tricked their way inside using their Trojan horse. The story describes a savage battle within the city walls during which many Trojans are massacred before the city is torched and burned to the ground.
Büyük bir ihtimalle o savaş burada olan bir savaştı. Burası Hisarlıktepe. Çok yüksek bir ihtimalle bütün verileri yan yana getirdiğimizde, bir araya getirdiğimizde Troya, çünkü başka bir alternatifi yok.
After decades of archaeological discovery here, perhaps the last great mystery of the Trojan War is what happened to the survivors. In Greece, Elena Korka and her team continue to scour the ruins for evidence that links it to the city of Tenea, founded by surviving Trojans.
The whole city was engulfed with different zones of cemeteries. So that meant, of course, that was a huge city all through the years.
The cemetery is an opportunity to learn more about the inhabitants of the city.
We're taking 3D data from the skull of an ancient Tenea, and we will try to reconstruct his face when he was alive in order to meet him.
Elena thinks that her discoveries show that this city does stand out as unusual.
So we have found remarkable objects and very many objects, which wasn't the normal case in the period. Perhaps the inhabitants had a different mentality and wanted to show their wealth.
Conclusive proof will need to come in future dig seasons. What's certain is that the Romans, at least, believed this was indeed Tenea, lost city of the last Trojans. The excavations in Greece are just the latest in the centuries-long hunt for the truth about the mythical Trojan War, a new avenue of investigation alongside the work in Hisarlik, Turkey, at the ruins of Troy. Rustam Aslan thinks there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered here.
In Troy, there is a two pinnacle, not excavated, but I don't want to touch. But I'm sure it is a very important find.
For 150 years, archaeologists have hunted for clues that might confirm if the story from the Iliad is based in historical fact. In the process, they've made a series of astonishing discoveries that shed new light on the people who lived here millennia ago and have pushed archaeological innovation to ever greater heights, testing out ever more powerful scanning and imaging tools to unlock the secrets of the past. The full truth about the Trojan War and the survivors of Troy may never be known, but the investigation and discoveries will continue.